This is Fothentic History.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Brian Young.
And I'm Holly Fry.
Holly.
Yes, my dear.
We're going to be talking about some really interesting people and battles today.
That is true.
It is. We're going to talk about a significant part of history of Andowine, specifically the antagonism between the kingdoms of Nockmaar, Tir Asleen, and Galadoorn, as it relates to the rise and fall of Bavmorda, the Demon Queen. And I knew if I put Demon Queen in there, you'd be interested.
Oh, I'm always interested in a little Demon Queen fun.
Yeah.
So, to start, we're going to lay the groundwork of the world of Andowine first. It was a world inhabited by many different species, and we're going to get into each of them individually. But just for general, it had a single moon and stars by which to navigate. And it was thought by most of its inhabitants to be flat and with a definitive end, but dragons and sorcerers had divined the truth of its heliocentric position in the universe.
The dominant species on Andowine were the Daikini, who were tall humanoid creatures who varied in height from 5 to 7 feet tall. They considered themselves the lords of Andowine and populated most regions of the planet. They had mastery of science and math, but were loosely divided up into different king and queendoms across the surface of the world. Some Daikini had mastery over magic as well, but we'll get into magic a little bit later.
The fairy world was responsible for many of the other species of Andowine, sometimes referred to as the mother world. A number of sentient species were known as lesser fairies, including the fairies themselves. The fairies and animals of the forest were ruled over by a benevolent entity known as Cherlindrea, and her mate, the Stag Lord. Cherlindrea was known as, quote, the Lally Maiden of the Forest, and controlled very powerful magic.
Nelwyns were another of the intelligent species of Andowine and related to lesser fairies. They were short in stature, never more than a few feet high. They were a much smaller population than the Daikinis as well, and were generally distrustful of their larger counterparts, who they referred to as giants or tall folk, in addition to referring to them as Daikinis. Nelwyns kept to themselves in the Nelwyn Valley, nestled along the River Freen in the western continent. They also had a mastery over magic and were led by the High Aldwin, who was a sorcerer in his own right.
Brownies were next on the lesser fairies important to the story. They greatly resembled Daikinis, but they only stood about 9 inches high, and they worshipped Cherlindrea as a goddess and did whatever she commanded. They were competent hunters and warriors, and they lived for 1,000 years. They also had a mischievous streak that would often get into trouble just out of the sheer boredom of their existence, causing discomfort and annoyance to the Nelwyns, Daikinis, pretty much anyone else who crossed their path. Daikinis actually considered them to be vermin.
Which is an interesting thought, right? Where you've got, like, sentient vermin.
Yeah. I mean, that could get us into a whole discussion about, Earth species and things like rats being sentient, because I would argue that they are. For them to be able to, like, trash talk you as you're doing something about it. Just because you don't understand their language, Brian.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean they're not trash talking you.
So there were many other species unique to Andowine as well, from dragons and trolls to ebersisks and centaurs. The diversity of species extended to other variations of lesser fairies as well, like dryads, naiads, and ogres.
And the Daikini kingdoms were the largest source of strife for those living on Andowine. And so we're going to get into the kingdoms there and the dynamics between the 3 chief kingdoms. We're going to start with Tir Asleen, which was considered the greatest of all the kingdoms. And Tir Asleen was on the far western side of the continent, north of the Nelwyn Valley and directly south of Nockmaar.
Tir Asleen magically induced peace and harmony in its residents, and this peace lasted for 1,000 years. They built libraries and monuments to Daikini art and science and really exemplified what Daikini achievement could be without having to worry about things like war.
Nockmaar, which was north of Tir Asleen, wasn't actually much of a kingdom until the rule of Queen Bavmorda. The Nockmaar Mountains were the original homes of the Malavoy, an ancient race that was said to have witnessed the dawn of creation. At some point, and the records of this are completely unclear, the Malavoy were banished to their own realm, and the inhospitable and volcanic mountains became the home to nomadic tribes of Daikines. We'll get into how they became a formidable force in Andowinian politics in just a bit.
So Galadoorn was the next kingdom, and really it was the free Daikini kingdom of the north, and it was set to the east of Nockmaar. It was said that it was second only to Tir Asleen in its splendor, and it was a beacon for refugees. So the culture there was a melting pot of cultures from all over Andowine, and Castle Galadoorn was protected by a chivalric order known predictably as the Knights of Galadoorn.
Things in Andowine took a turn for the worse with the rise of Bavmorda, whose full title at the height of her power was Her Majesty Bavmorda, Sovereign of Nockmaar, Sorceress Magnific, Primal Priestess of Cults and Covens. And I have to say, while I love that title, like, that's a heavy business card.
Yeah.
That's just, the kerning alone would be a nightmare.
And it's literally made of bone.
But that is not where her story begins, because for that, we actually have to go back to her younger days.
Bavmorda was born in the valley of Tir Asleen, and it was said that at the hour of her birth, the nocturnal creatures of the land assembled outside her mother's chamber as a portent of her power to be as an enchantress. There was no indication that she would be problematic for the kingdom, though, and she received tutelage under a number of great masters and enchanters, including Shirlindria herself.
Bavmorda was gifted with abilities in magic, even as a toddler. It was said that she could float before she could walk, and could understand arcane spells at a glance, even as a young student. Some histories say that she cared little in those formative years for anything except the pursuit of magical studies.
Things took a turn in Bavmorda's life at this point, but before we can really get into that, we need to really establish Fin Raziel. Fin Raziel was a sorceress who was tutored by King Tanthalos VIII's court magician Volsant. And Volsant took Fin Raziel as his student, hoping to make her his successor, as she was quite adept in magic. As a teenager, though, she fell in love with Prince Michael Tanthalos and paid little attention to her studies. And it was at this point that Volsant threatened to abandon her as a student if she didn't focus.
Bavmorda and Fin Raziel studied in proximity with each other and found themselves quickly at odds with one another. They first encountered each other as students with a hint of cordiality, but things changed with their first major confrontation. In the library at Tir Asleen, both students were studying, and Fin Raziel used her magic to attract a sparrow into the library.
Raziel admired the bird and just let it go, but Bavmorda brought it back and transformed it into a glass statuette. And then when Bavmorda returned the bird to its normal form, she told Raziel that she'd only let it live because she just didn't feel like killing it in that particular moment. Raziel left the library upset, surprised by that conversation and that entire interaction she had with Bavmorda, not realizing that this was what led to the appearance of a book known as the Malatrium.
And the Malatrium was a spell book of evil sorcery that had a will and a mind of its own. After this incident with the bird, it appeared before Bavmorda. And after finding the book, Bavmorda tucked it beneath her arm, made her farewells, and quickly left the castle of Tir Asleen, and then she disappeared for a year.
In that year, the courtship of Fin Raziel and Prince Tanthalos had intensified to the point of engagement. Bavmorda put on a smile and returned to Tir Asleen. And one of the first things she did was seduce Prince Tanthalos. Using knowledge she'd gained from studying the Malatrium, she enchanted the prince and convinced him to break off his engagement with Fin Raziel and marry her instead.
None of the wizards, sorcerers, and enchanters in the land intervened at this point, thinking that this was just a matter of the heart and not something more sinister that Bavmorda had planned. Bavmorda and Prince Tanthalos quickly married, and Bavmorda bore Tanthalos a daughter, Sorcia. And during her pregnancy and the early days of Sorcia's life, Bavmorda remained cordial to her in-laws and those in the court.
Just a brief aside on Sorsha, it was said that she had the sweet disposition of her father, but Bavmorda worked to subvert the will of her daughter, even as an infant, using magic. So for her formative years, because of these enchantments, Sorsha remained devoted solely to her mother and no one else.
But just after Sorsha had been born, tragedy struck the kingdom. The king, Tantalos VIII, and his wife the queen were killed. Bavmorda was raised to the title of queen consort to King Tantalos IX, and then things carried on. Suspicion over those particular deaths arose in some places, but no one really thought that Bavmorda could have been responsible for killing her in-laws, even though that was in fact exactly what had happened.
Slowly, Bavmorda consolidated her power, and she ended up ending the reign of Tir Asleen in one fell swoop. With her magic, she encased the court of Tir Asleen, including her husband Tantalos IX, in courts and left trolls to guard the city that was then abandoned.
Fin Raziel confronted Bavmorda in a desperate last-ditch effort to save the status quo of the kingdom, but Fin Raziel could not overcome her. Bavmorda found that although she was able to defeat Fin Raziel with her overpowering magic, she couldn't actually kill her. Fin Raziel was far too powerful for that.
What Bavmorda did was actually transform her into a possum and exile her to an island just east of the Nelwyn Valley. After Fin Raziel was taken care of, Bavmorda abandoned Tir Asleen completely and fled for Nockmaar. Nockmaar, as we said, was previously independent, full of these roving bands of nomads, but when Bavmorda, who became known at this time as the Demon Queen, took over, these roaming packs had little choice but to accept her rule. Bavmorda enslaved them and had them build her a fortress in Nockmaar, which became the new seat of her power.
With that new fortress at Nockmaar and the kingdom of Tir Asleen literally encased in stone, Bavmorda was able to strengthen her power and set her eye toward other kingdoms in Andowine.
But word spread of a prophecy. Seers and prophets from all over Galadoorn, Nockmaar, Kashmir, and the outlying areas of Tir Asleen all told of a vision that a baby would be born with a certain mark, and this child would be gifted and be able to be the downfall of Bavmorda.
Naturally, Bavmorda had no interest in losing her position on her way to rule of all of Andowine, so she declared that every pregnant woman they could find would be brought to Nockmaar and would give birth there, and any babies bearing the mark would be killed, thereby assuring that she would remain in power as long as she could maintain her own life.
Years passed while Bavmorda sought the birth of this prophesied child. Sorsha grew into one of her trusted chiefs and lieutenants, and war was waged across the land. The Knights of Galadoorn put up valiant defenses to oppose the forces of Nockmaar, but eventually things sort of reached a boiling point.
The turning point really happened with the birth of Elora Danan. She was born in the pens of Nockmaar Castle and found to have had the prophesied mark that spelled doom for Bavmorda. The mother of Elora begged Ethna, the attending midwife, to save the child, as Bavmorda was on her way to sacrifice the infant to break the prophecy.
Ethna whisked the baby away, and the nameless mother of the foretold baby feigned that she was still holding it. So when Bavmorda arrived, it took her and her retinue a few minutes to get to the pen, discover this ruse, and this all gave Ethna a chance to escape with Elora Danan.
Ethna made it as far as the river Freen before being caught by the death dogs under Bavmorda's influence. Death dogs were ferocious pack-hunting animals that were said to be creations of foul sorcery. They hunted Ethna and Elora across the land until they reached the river.
At that point, Ethna set Elora on a raft downriver, hoping that somehow she'd be saved in order to fulfill the prophecy, which is quite a leap of faith, right? Like putting literally an infant in a raft by herself and just sending her downstream is... that's a lot.
It's an act of great faith, right?
Yeah. So the death dogs at that point tore the midwife to shreds. Fortunately for Elora Danan, though, she found herself in the Nelwyn Valley, which was largely untouched by the war, and a young Nelwyn farmer family found her and took her in. This family was the Ufgoods, and the father, Willow, was a would-be sorcerer in his own right and an amateur prestidigitator.
It was at this point that Bavmorda began waging her campaign against the rest of Andowine. This is when Bavmorda's General Kael marched with the Nockmaar army to Land's End and crushed the Galadoorn resistance there, and then marched on Castle Galadoorn itself. The Knights of Galadoorn put up a really valiant defense, but they were outnumbered, and this was largely a slaughter.
It's been said that this was in response to the missing child of prophecy. The army of Nockmaar was assuredly looking for Elora Danan, as were the Death Dogs and any other agents of Nockmaar all across Andowine. So this was just sort of like, it sounds like she was ready to take over all these places anyway, but at the point where they could be harboring this child, it was as good a time as any to start beating those doors down.
The Nelwyns realized that the Daikinis were looking for a baby when Death Dogs made their way into the Nelwyn Valley and knocked over cradles and then would attack. Fortunately, Nelwyn warriors repelled the attack, and the High Aldwyn dispatched many of the warriors and farmers to set forth out of the Nelwyn Valley with the child. This group was led, nominally, by Willow Ufgood, who had been given magic acorns by the High Aldwyn.
The Fellowship of Nelwyns were to take the Daikini child, who they had no idea was special, to the first Daikini they found at the crossroads, and hand the baby over to them. By the time they made it to the crossroads, they found two different things. First was the remains of the Knights of Galadoorn marching to Tir Asleen to form a force known as the Tir Asleen Rebels, and they tried to hand Elora Danan to the army, but they were very quickly dismissed. You know, what army wants to take a baby in? Especially after suffering such a horrible defeat at the hands of General Kael.
Right, and I think you could make the case that just logistically, a group of soldiers is really not like the place for a baby to be anyway.
True, unless
they probably did not have the means for childcare.
I wonder if they would have taken her, though, if the Nelwyns had known that she was the baby of prophecy, right?
Probably.
Like, they'd have been like, oh, we can deal with her.
Right. And then the second person they encountered at the crossroads was a swordsman named Madmartigan. Madmartigan was in a crow's cage there. He had been left to die. And he managed to convince the homesick Nelwyns to let him out of the cage and take custody of Elora Danan, and then they all went their separate ways. Unfortunately, Madmartigan lost the baby when brownies, under the direction of Sherlindria, kidnapped her.
Willow Ufgood was roped back into the situation by the brownies and brought before Sherlindria herself. The High Fae explained the prophecy to him and tasked him with finding the sorceress Fin Raziel and taking this powerful infant to Tir Asleen on his own.
Along the way, he re-encountered Madmartigan, and the two made a hasty escape. Madmartigan led Willow to the island of Fin Raziel, where they discovered that Bavmorda had turned her into a possum. Using Sherlindria's wand, Willow attempted to transform Fin Raziel back into a human, but he was unable to complete that spell. He did succeed in transforming her into a rook instead.
When Madmartigan, the newly winged Fin Raziel, and Willow Ufgood, along with Elora Danan and the two brownies that they had, Rule and Frangine, that had been with them, when they returned to the shore, they found that a contingent of Nockmaar soldiers led by Bavmorda's daughter Sorsha was waiting for them. Sorsha took them prisoner and began heading to Nockmaar Castle with them, but they had to encamp in the mountains for the night on their way.
It's sort of a long story at this point, but suffice it to say, an escape attempt was planned, but complicated when Madmartigan caught whiff of a brownie love potion, thereby significantly attracting him to Sorsha. And one thing led to another, and Willow, Madmartigan, and the restolen Elora Danan captured Sorsha and brought her with them during their escape.
Yeah, love potions make, escaping problematic when you decide you're in love with your jailer.
I mean, they make everything problematic, so you could say any situation after that, but yes, it is especially an issue when you're trying to escape the person you're attracted to.
Yeah. As this group made their way to the ruins of Tir Asleen, Sorsha actually escaped again and was able to alert the Nockmaar army. Madmartigan launched a valiant one-man defense of the castle, nominally aided by Willow Ufgood, who did use one of his acorns to deal with one of the trolls there. But there was an Ebersisk. It was a big, long thing. We could do a whole episode just about that one battle of the castle of Tir Asleen there. But eventually, the Nockmaar army, led by General Kael and Sorsha, overcame them and captured Elora Danan once more.
The forces of Nockmaar whisked Elora Danan to Nockmaar Castle, and the Demon Queen Bavmorda prepared the Ritual of Oblivion at the top of her tower in order to banish Elora Danan's spirit to the Netherworld. She wagered that this would end any chance of the prophecy coming true and cement her place as the ruler of all of Andowine.
But the forces of good weren't going to take this laying down. They found that they had a new ally. After the Battle of Tir Asleen, seeing the lengths her mother would go to in order to murder a baby, and the genuine feelings she'd developed for Madmartigan, Sorsha defected to the Tir Asleen rebels and led them straight to Nockmaar Castle.
So hooray for Love Potion.
Yeah. Well, she didn't get hit with the Love Potion. It would be weird if that was her, but
right,
I guess that was enough to spark those
wheels in
yeah.
motion, right.
Yeah.
While the army was assembled in front of Nockmaar Castle, Bavmorda seemed to not find them to be much of a threat. In fact, she used her powerful magic to turn most of the army into pigs. But it was Willow and Fin Raziel that won the day here. Willow was able to use Sherlindria's wand to transform Fin Raziel finally back into a human, and she was able to bring the army back to its strength, which had been completely underestimated by Bavmorda.
This is really where Sorsha's defection helped out the most. As Nockmaar's army attacked the Tir Asleen rebels in the encampment in front of the castle, Sorsha was able to sneak Fin Raziel and Willow Ufgood into the high tower of Nockmaar Castle in order to interrupt the spell of Oblivion that would cast Elora Danan out. Bavmorda incapacitated her own daughter for her treachery and turned her attention to Fin Raziel. Willow, at this point, was able to distract them long enough to cause her undoing. As we said earlier, he was an amateur prestidigitator, and his famous trick was that he could make a pig disappear. He used this disappearing pig trick to hide Elora Danan and confuse Bavmorda, and long enough to turn the tide of the battle.
And Bavmorda spilled the blood of the ritual, which caused her own downfall, and thereby ended the war. Outside, General Kael killed Eric, the leader of the Knights of Galadoorn, but was himself killed by Madmartigan, and the tide turned for the Tir Asleen rebels.
With Bavmorda gone, sort of, having botched her own spell fatally because of Willow's distraction, Tir Asleen was able to resume its place as the Jewel of Andowine. As rightful heir, Sorsha, along with her consort Madmartigan, repaired the castle and raised the orphaned Elora Danan on their own. And there was peace in the land for quite some time after that. But that's the end of the rise and the fall of Bavmorda.
So much baby action.
Yeah, no, it's one thing to have to do battle, but to have to do battle juggling an infant because they're the source of prophecy that's actually going to bring down the evil Demon Queen, that adds a layer of difficulty. But it's interesting too, the prophecy didn't say this baby's going to do it specifically and personally, which I think is what Bavmorda thought, but the baby really coalesced all the forces of Andowine together in a really interesting way.
Yeah, the baby serves more as a catalyst than an actual participant in the whole thing.
Yeah, it could have been any baby in any mark, really, at that point. Which just goes to show you, prophecies can be, whatever they want to be.
Right. You can't take them literally if you believe them at all.
Yeah. So that's it for this episode. I don't have any mail, Holly.
That's fine.
If people would like to send us mail, they can do so by using the contact form at fauthentichistory.com. We'd love to hear your stories from all of the different regions and worlds we do history about. And where can people find you, Holly?
I can be found on Twitter as Surliest Girl and on Instagram as SurlyGirly5. My other podcast, Stuff You Missed in History Class, is at missedinhistory.com, and Missed in History is our handle across social media. And then sometimes you and I talk about Star Wars together.
Sometimes. How about every week?
Yay!
Yeah, we do the Full of Sith podcast, so you can go there to check that out at fullofsith.com and listen to us talk about Star Wars all the time there. And if you want to find me, you can find me across most social medias at Swankmatron, and that's Twitter, Patreon, Instagram, wherever fine social media accounts are sold. And you can find my writing about things at starwars.com/film, sci-fi, and just wherever. I'm all over the place. As far as Authentic History, our entire back catalog is live at authentichistory.com, and we've got all kinds of different subjects there you can learn about. And we're actually doing a live show, aren't we, Holly?
We are. We are going to be at Star Wars Celebration Chicago in April, doing a live show on Saturday.
It will be a great time.
Yeah, I'm excited.
So, unless you've got anything else, Holly.
I do not offhand.
Well, until next time.